Welcome to Oh God, What Now? And on today's show, the Lib Dems are at a historic high. So why aren't they getting more attention? Ed Davey's Reborn party achieved a record 72 seats in the last election, taking many Tory scalps, including Justice Secretary Alex Chalk and Education Secretary Gillian Keegan along the way. Disgust with the Conservatives helped, but so did Davey's eye-catching stunts like bungee jumping from a crane, paddleboarding across Lake Windermere to draw attention to water pollution, and performing CPR on a dummy to the sound of the Bee Gees' Staying Alive. But since then, it has been harder for the party to get traction, with Reform UK getting the bulk of newspaper coverage. How can the Lib Dems cut through when the media seems so dazzled by a shiny new Nigel? Can they become the real alternative to Labour? And what makes Ed Davey tick? He is here with us today to discuss all that and more. Hello, Sir Ed.
Hi, Alison. Lovely to be with you all.
You became leader 5 years ago this very month.
Yeah, that's right.
And at that point, I think the Lib Dems were polling about 6%. Mm-hmm. Now you're about 15 to 16%, so that's good.
We only had 11 MPs as well.
Yes, so that's pretty impressive, isn't it? So, but apart from increasing your seats, thinking back to where you were exactly 5 years ago, what did you want to achieve, do you think, and do you feel you've achieved it?
Well, it's still work in progress because I want to do even better for the party and better for the values that we represent. But, the 72 seats we won at the last general election was historic high for us. But I think we can build on that. I mean, in my wildest dreams, I didn't think we'd win as many and defeat as many Conservative MPs and a few SNP along the way. And I think we did it through focusing on what voters cared about, really. And sometimes I think political parties can, go off to the extremes and do all quirky things. But I said, look, let's listen to voters. Their concerns are health and care. Their concerns are the cost of living. A lot of them worry about things to do with the environment, which is one of the things that's very dear to my own heart. And so we talked about those things relentlessly. And some people got very cross with it because that's all we talked about. But it seemed to work, I think, because we were genuinely engaging with people's concerns.
And was there anything looking back now that at that point you did want to achieve, but you feel you've quite yet got to get there?
Well, I just think making sure that people agree with our ideas and our values. And there's no doubt in modern politics, liberalism and progressive values are under attack from both the extremes, actually. And I want to make sure that people go, you know what? Actually, people with sensible, decent values and proper policies have thought it all through. They deserve to get a go to run our country, run our councils, and have power. So it's about making our argument. And I think since the election, actually, when I set ourselves a target of being the best opposition, we have been the ones leading the way in the debate. It's not always covered by, the great BBC and others, but, the carers debate, the carers allowance, they haven't gone the whole hog on social care reform, but they've reviewed carers allowance, which is a Tory scandal, and the Tories refused to. They've adopted our policies that weren't in their manifesto, were in ours, abolishing Ofwat, because we need to really get tough on the water industry and their failures and sewage and the rest of it. And take a really important social justice issue. We were campaigning last election to make sure that every child whose family was in receipt of universal credit got free school meals. Labour opposed that election. They've now done it. So there's a series of issues which I would say we have been the best opposition. And we've held the government to account on Europe, on Trump, on Gaza, and so many issues. So, I think we are making our voice heard in Parliament. I like it more heard in the wider media, but we're working on that and we're getting some coverage, and I'm delighted to be on your programme.
So we'll talk a bit more about the future of the Lib Dems as we go along and the fight with reform. But we've also got two other Oh God, What Now regulars with us. So first up, journalist and social affairs commentator Hannah Fearn. Hello, Hannah.
Hello.
You're recently back from holidays. Were there any Ed Davey-style water activities?
The white knuckle ride of paddling off the coast of the Isle of Wight with preschoolers. But
I say.
Terrifying.
So we've just heard in the last sort of day or so that the police are now going to be encouraged to reveal the ethnicity and nationality of suspects who have been charged in high-profile cases. It comes after the case of the police were accused of hiding the identities of two men who are allegedly Afghan asylum seekers who'd been charged over the alleged rape of 12-year-old child in Warwickshire. And then, of course, there were the Southport riots last year where there was the issues around false information about the identity of the killer. And then, of course, there was also the incident in Liverpool where the car went into a crowd where there was information about that person very swiftly. So what are you thinking? Is this a good idea, a bad idea?
I'm a bit mixed, but like everything at the moment, I feel like this is a policy that can't seem to see the unintended consequences that are right just beyond the end of our nose. It's obviously done with good intention, trying to set out some clear guidelines so that everybody is responding in the same way and that people, the citizens, know what information they are entitled to when a crime like this occurs. And naming is, as you pointed out, supposed to kind of shine a bit of cleansing daylight on the rumour that can go around and frankly, racism that is stoked as a result. The problem is, we shouldn't be removing people's rights to early anonymity in all kinds of ways, simply to solve another issue, which is the way the far right is mishandling the question of immigration and forcing it on top of our crime stats, which is two totally separate issues, and the way they are abusing that for political gain. So my concern is that what we're implying here is we'll let you know when it's someone who is brown, so you'll know when to riot, which it's very dangerous. Why are we entitled to that information if it's not because we're implying there should be a different reaction depending on somebody's race?
And surely also the question is, what is a high-profile case?
Yes.
Because you're just going to end up with these edge cases, and it's just going to go lower and lower and lower, and to the point where every single crime you have to say who the ethnicity is, and then that becomes just standard practice, and we've lost something quite important, I think.
For me, I feel that this is another example of how a rush to try and do something positive ends up creating really dangerous precedents that we will struggle to undo later on.
And it's also an issue of like who is creating the agenda and who is just responding to the agenda, I guess. But also on today's panel, we have comedian, actor and writer Matt Green, currently preparing for a trip to Edinburgh.
Yep, next week.
Oh, how exciting. Matt, surely comedians and politicians have so much in common, willing to make a spectacle of themselves in the desperate hunt for attention. Yes? No?
Yeah, I mean, the phrase politics is show business for ugly people, it just is around.
What a thing to say.
It'd be a very mean thing to say in the current circumstances, but I would never say that. But I don't know. I'll put a little bit of a plea for comedians here, because I think when we make a mistake, we tend to just sort of bruise our egos and waste someone's time, whereas when politicians make mistakes, mortgages go up.
Good point. And Matt, I think you've also been looking quite keenly this week at the state visit of JD Vance to the Cotswolds, and all those locals being forced off the road by a fleet of black Land Rovers. Even Jeremy Clarkson was annoyed. And also it appears that David Lammy's fishing trip wasn't just sort of excruciating to watch, it was also very rule-breaking.
Yeah, I mean, I love the fact that they're obviously taking a leaf out of Ed's book of trying to do something water-based as a stunt, but they literally did a photo shoot of him breaking the law. It's an extraordinary thing. It's like doing a photo shoot. In fact, didn't that happen a couple of years ago in an election where someone did a video of himself not wearing a seatbelt in the car?
Yeah. Was that Rishi Sunak?
Yeah. Wasn't it? And I think Boris Johnson did something similar as well.
All the time.
Yeah.
Right, well, quite, yeah. That's very much
right.
the least of his problems. But I just think that's very entertaining. It I think led to my favourite statement I've ever heard from a government source recently. A spokesman from the Foreign Office said, the Foreign Secretary has written to the Environment Agency over an administrative oversight that meant the appropriate licences had not been acquired for fishing on a private lake as part of a diplomatic engagement at Chevening House last week. It's like every single part of that sentence makes it more and more awful to listen to. And also, there's no indication whether JD Vance had a licence. I imagine.
No.
I mean, they're driving on the wrong side of the road with his motorcade. They're pissing off locals left, right and centre. My favourite thing about this whole JD Vance thing, which isn't a state visit, it's just a holiday.
Yeah.
He's just on holiday. Is I think you can take a lot of things away from the British, but the one thing that we have in spades is the ability to take the piss, and the fact that you've got people following him around with a van with that meme of him looking like an egg on it. You've got people holding up placards saying JD Vance's password is password, things like this. It's just like there was a great quote from a local woman who said, generally we like to welcome everyone to Chipping Norton, but no, I'd absolutely kick him in the shins.
It was also very JD Vance, that whole thing where he said, my children caught lots of fish, where it was clear that David Lammy hadn't caught any fish.
Yeah. David Lammy's clearly never touched a fishing rod before. If you see the photos, he's sort of holding it in two hands and it's sort of like, is this how you do it? I don't know, you know.
Ed Davey, let's start with last year's general election, that famous high point for the Lib Dems. And yes, there had been much guffawing about your water activities during the campaign, but it did get you the broadcast media that you required to have your stories heard and to have your policies heard. And beyond that, what do you think it was, though, that really chimed with the voters at that point? What was it the Lib Dems were saying to the British people? But is that still there, or has that moment passed?
At the moment, it's still there. The issues we campaigned on are still top of people's lists. So we did a lot on health and care. I talked about my story as a carer myself, been a carer most of my life, and we did the party election broadcast about my experience as a carer.
Which was incredibly moving, yeah.
That really resonated, and we've kept on campaigning about care, whether it's the social care agenda or, I think, as equally as important, family carers, the millions of people out there who care for their loved ones. And Labour has not touched that agenda properly. So that's a massive issue. No other party's talking about that, right? Remind the BBC, please.
Why do you think the government haven't really got into that issue? Because, as you say, it affects so many people. Why is it still not being addressed?
Because I think the Treasury has won already. They set this mad deadline, that the Casey Review, which is looking to social care reform, doesn't have to report for 3 years. And they've actually said that its recommendations won't be implemented till the middle of the next decade. I mean, it's just not serious, right? And so that looks like a Treasury victory to me, because if they're making an announcement a year out of the election, you know what's going to happen to that. So I'm really disappointed, and that's why we've kept on and on about it. The Tories have said nothing. Reform said nothing. We're being the ones talking about that. So I still think that message from the last election resonates now. Cost of living was another massive issue. It's not gone away. It really hasn't. Whether it's energy bills, which we're really focusing in on, or water bills, or housing costs, it's massive, and people are still hurting out there. And, we also made a big issue around the environment, particularly on sewage pollution. And the government's done something on that, but we don't think it's gone anywhere near far enough. So do I think the messages that we felt resonated in all the seats we won, whether they are still powerful messages? We do. I mean, obviously there's other things come along, Trump responding to the Labour government's, I think, many failures, lack of ambition, lack of vision, and from a progressive point of view, a liberal point of view, we've got an alternative. So I think there's a big space for us, and we want to keep pushing at that, building on what we achieved at the last election, and obviously the stunts as well. Who knows? They've been continuing, and long may they.
They have. I suppose the counter argument to the stunts is: do they lead some people to think that you are a less serious proposition to some of the other offers that are out there?
Do you know, normal politicians are so popular, aren't they? so I think being a normal politician isn't a great model to go for. I mean, listen, there are two reasons we did it, right? Let me be very frank with you. First was to get attention, right? Because we found that cameras just weren't coming, and we needed to force them to come, and we did. And I spent more time talking about Liberal Democrat policy at the last election than most of my predecessors have ever done, because we got the cameras there, and having done the silly stunt, or whether it was the bungee jump, the paddleboard, or whatever, they then had to ask us questions. So we actually got to tell our story. But there's another important, which I think is more profound in a way. I'd noticed, and I've talked about this for a few years now, that the extremes, particularly the right, have talked to people's emotions, to their hearts. They made them laugh, whether it's Boris Johnson ruffling his hair, or Nigel Farage pulling a pint, and all that sort of caper. And I think progressive politicians have felt uncomfortable about going there. Well, why? If it's working for our opponents, obviously we don't agree with their policies and their values, but let's talk to people's hearts. And we try to do that by making them laugh and making them cry and grabbing their attention. And I think we've got to do that. Now, would you have done it 20 years ago? Probably not. But politics has changed, and we need to adapt. I'm determined to win for our values, right? Coming second place when we have people like Farage, it's not good enough. And so we have to find every which way. And if that means some people think I'm being a little bit ridiculous, that's fine. But as long as it is working, and I think it worked pretty well the last election myself.
Well, it did. You have a historic total of 72 MPs, which is obviously incredibly impressive turnaround. Do you feel that you have now sort of finally exercised the ghost of the coalition era?
Yeah, I mean, to be honest, on the doorsteps, when you knock on doors, it very rarely raise, hardly ever. And people are more interested in what you've got to say now about their problems and their concerns. And I was talking to a friend of mine who's been knocking on doors in the last few weeks, and I've been on holiday, I have to confess. He was saying things that are coming out were the cost of living, actually. And Gaza was coming up on a few doorsteps from a few people. Issues always change, don't they? But at the moment, not surprisingly, that's what people are raising with us.
So is that, do you think, partly due to the passage of time? Just, it's been a long time since Nick Clegg was party leader. Or is it that you're speaking to those issues in a way that other parties aren't?
It's probably a mixture of that and other things as well, right? I mean, there's been a lot of water in the bridge since 2015 at the end of the coalition. We've had Brexit, we've had the pandemic, we've had innumerable Conservative prime ministers. So things have changed. And I like to think what we are doing now in the Liberal Democrats is showing a different face as well.
You were part of the coalition.
Yeah,
How do you feel about those years yourself when you think back?
Well, I focus on the things that I thought we did well on. So I've talked about CARE, the 2014 CARE Act, which was pushed forward by Liberal Democrats, people like Norman Lamb and Paul Burstow, Liberal Democrat health and care ministers. That stood the test of time. And if it had been implemented, we wouldn't have the social care crisis we've got now. What happened? We passed the act, the Tories voted for it. A year later, after they won their majority, they reneged on it. 1 million people aren't getting the care they need who would have had it if the Conservatives implemented a piece of legislation that Liberal Democrats pioneered. I'm really proud of our record on things like taking the low paid out of tax. We increased the basic personal tax allowance, which is worth more to low paid people than it is to well paid people. Unfortunately, Conservatives froze that and brought the lowest paid back into tax. And we're seeing signs that Labour's continue on that. So they're raising tax in a really quiet, stealthy way, but it's hitting the low paid the hardest. Now, that was the reverse of what Liberal Democrats did. So I can point to a number of things where I'm really proud. We've talked our record on renewables, for example. But I think we did a lot of good things there. I think we played the politics pretty badly, as the 2015 election showed. Let me be honest about that.
As you sort of referred to there, you were Energy and Climate Change Secretary back under the coalition at a point where the Conservatives cared about the environment, which seems
some of them.
Everyone's moved on from there. And you set decarbonisation targets for electricity. And we are seeing some progress from Ed Miliband's department at the moment. But as we say, certainly it's completely fallen out of favour with both the Conservatives, and it's not a thing at all for reform. Does that open a real space of opportunity then, do you think, for the Lib Dems?
Yeah, we've got to show, though, how it will cut people's energy bills.
So right, that's number one consideration now.
Well, it sort of was as before, because, by the way, the sunshine is free and the wind is free.
But right? People did used to think it was a good thing in its own right, didn't they? Sort of anti.
Well, it's a good thing, not just because of climate change, of course it is, but also its independence. We import a lot of the gas that we use now, and we've been importing a lot of gas since 2005, by the way. So, whatever happens in the North Sea, we'll be importing huge amounts of gas. So by going for the wind and solar, which are the most popular forms of power and the cheapest, you make yourself independent of Russia and others. And also, actually, you have lower bills. I mean, the reason why people's power bills are high at the moment is because of gas. Gas power stations set the price nearly 100% of the time. And if Nigel Farage and, Kemi Badenoch think that gas is the solution, well, they're basically saying people can have higher energy bills. What Liberal Democrats are saying is we want lower energy bills. We want to halve people's energy bills over the next decade. And the way to do it, there's several ways, but the main way to do it is to make sure that the power stations that are setting the price for everybody are wind or solar.
Because electricity is the most expensive form of energy at the moment. For consumers.
Yeah, it is, and it's disaster.
Yeah.
So I mean, the one thing I agree about, Nigel Farage, if you like, is that energy prices are way too high. So we can all agree that energy prices are way too high. The question is, who's got the right solution? He's got the solution which should put them up. He'd make us more dependent on Putin's Russia. If we're proud Brits who want to have our own energy, that's the cheapest form, we should be going gangbusters. And my main criticism of Ed Miliband, who, by the way, I've got a lot of time for, I think he's done a lot of good things and gets really bad press in certain parts of the media, at least, is he is serious about this agenda, but he just needs to go fast and take the whole of the government with him. He's not getting that support that he needs to make sure we can roll the cheapest form of electricity out quicker.
But that tension is there within government because they need growth, so they want housing and they want another runway at Heathrow. Where do the Lib Dems stand on that then? Because we need those things for growth, we're told, but they're going to damage the environment.
Well, I don't think extra housing necessarily damages the environment. It's how it's done, right? It's an issue dear to my heart. I was talking to Hannah about it before we came on. My wife is a housing portfolio holder in my local council. I met her on a Liberal Democrat housing policy working group. Some people should say I should get out more, but
not me. I don't say that.
And not my wife, fortunately. She's in charge of the largest council house building programme we've seen in my borough for over 40 years. And that's being done in a completely environmentally sustainable way. So more houses doesn't necessarily mean damage to the environment. Not saying there aren't going to be moments where you are going to have to see some sort of trade-offs, but I think you can manage those trade-offs. I think they're far less concerning than many people think if you get it right. If you take communities with you, and we've always been a community-led approach to housing. Heathrow, listen, I think people, if they think the growth of the British economy is determined by a third runway at Heathrow, they don't know much about economics. For a start, this isn't going to happen for a decade or more, if it ever happens. And there are many other transport projects. What we ought to do, to be honest, is be really investing in an industry that we used to lead the world on, which is aerospace. And we have brilliant engineers in British Aerospace and other companies. And we should be leading the world and producing the zero carbon flight. Imagine if you're the country and you've got the companies and the economy that produces zero carbon flight. We led the world, I would say, thanks to Liberal Democrat policies on offshore wind. Mm-hmm. We led the world on that. I mean, China's now overtaken us, but that's perhaps not surprising. But we're still the second largest producer of offshore wind, and we've got a lot more to do on that. And we should be really proud of that. We got the price down. It was our policies that delivered that, Liberal Democrat policies. I would like to see zero carbon flight. And if you do, you achieve that. And I think it is achievable. Then these issues go away. They become less significant. We can bring people together, which is, frankly, what the Democrats are about. We see a very divisive politics, whether it's on the environment or whether it's on relationship with the United States and Europe. Very divisive. And we've got to bring people together. And that's what I'm trying to do in the way I go about our politics.
So talking of divisiveness, we should probably talk about Reform, who are obviously threatening the government, but also basically every party. They're getting way more coverage across the board, and they have 4 MPs to your 72. And of course, the Greens also have 4. Do you feel like you're being squeezed out of the national conversation? And if so, is there anything you can do about that?
Well, listen, you think about this a lot, obviously, doing my job. But I do know that the Conservative Party gets more coverage than we do, but I don't want their coverage because basically everyone's saying how bad they are. And the sort of coverage Reform gets is either by saying really nasty things that we don't agree with, being very divisive and extreme, or it's by their own internal argument, the tittle-tattle. Now, I don't want that coverage for the Liberal Democrats, thank you very much. And Labour government's getting more coverage than me. Of course they are, but it's always not very good. So sometimes not getting coverage, you obviously want to be in the news and want to be part of the story. But at the moment, the other part is, as far as I'm seeing, getting coverage I don't want. And if you look at actually what we're achieving, not just the last general election, which we've talked about with our record success, but since then, look at the local elections last May. It was our 7th year in a row where we had an increase in the number of councillors. That's never happened before in our history. We got a better result than Labour and the Conservatives. That had never happened before. And while everyone talked about Reform, they should have talked to us about us winning councils we never held before, and cementing and consolidating the seats we won from the Tories at the last election and going further into seats we could hope take the next election. So, and look at council by-elections, you look at polls showing that we're leading in the 18 to 24, more than double reform support amongst young people. Not reported by the BBC. Is that a theme I'm trying to get out there? So there's lots of things that we are succeeding, even though we're not getting the coverage. I think our values and our distinctive positions on care, on health, on environment, on Trump, on Gaza, on Europe, those distinctive positions we've got and talk about would deserve more coverage, I think, in a truly neutral media.
Do you think that then the media treats Farage differently? And I say we, as a journalist working in the mainstream press regularly, do we let him play by different rules because he seems to be a good story? You mentioned before he's a lot of fun in some ways that don't translate to being a decent human being in terms of his policies. But
well, I always get worried about politicians telling the media what to do. Right? Other politicians don't seem to mind that, but I think you'll be careful about what you tell the media. But I would just ask the media just to reflect a little bit more on, and are they giving undue coverage to certain views and certain people? It's almost as if parts of the media are afraid of their own shadow when it comes to Nigel Farage and his ilk. But when there are parties out there who I think are stronger, are traditionally been stronger, whose values reflect, I think, more people. I said, I think it was the last local elections, that we're determined to win over Middle England, and we've started that process. And Middle England has been voting primarily Tory, I guess, but also Labour. Some of it may even be flirting with reform. But I think our opportunity is to represent that vast majority of Middle England, Middle Britain, that are open to decent party with decent values who have thought through how they want to run the country rather than just made it up in the bar.
Have you got people then joining you now that would sort of have described themselves as sort of one nation Tories?
Oh yeah. At
local level, you're getting a few of them come to you now.
Yeah, we've got people who've defected to us, who were councillors over a period of years, right? Mm-hmm. Over a period of years. And certainly in terms of the voters, we saw that. That's why we won all those seats, right? We didn't win those seats simply by, other non-Tory parties voting for us.
But members, where they're hemorrhaging members, aren't they, in the Conservatives at the moment?
Yeah, well, some are going to reform, right?
On that side. But there are a lot that don't like the idea of what Robert Jenrick leadership can look like after Kemi Badenoch, perhaps.
I don't have any figures, right? But I have a sense that there's certainly more than a trickle. And I think it could increase. Who knows? My job as leader of the Lib Dems is to set out our stall in every opportunity that I have. And I'll get 2 questions every week at Prime Minister's Questions. I used to get 1 every 5 weeks, so it's a rather big increase, and it's great. And we've been focusing in on all the things I've talked about just in this podcast, health and care. People are saying it's going down the agenda a little bit. By the time it gets to the general election, it will be the issue again. It always is, because that people worry about their health and their wealth, don't they? And so the health service is a big issue. We're the only party really putting forward an alternative to the Labour government with credibility. And going back to the reform point and looking at politics at the moment, if people think that what we have now in the first year of Parliament is going to be what we have in the months leading up to the next general election, they're very much mistaken. I could take you back to so many examples in history, but if I look at it from my own party's perspective, I remember vaguely the 1983 election. If you'd gone back to 1981, 1982, the SDP Liberal Alliance were at one stage 50% in the opinion polls. One of my predecessors said, go back to your constituencies and prepare for government and all that stuff. And they ended up going down from 50% of the vote to 26, and most significantly only got 23 seats. Right. So things dramatically changed in less than 2 years. And the idea that people think that Nigel Farage is going to be the next Prime Minister and it's for certain, it's nonsense, absolute nonsense. I think it's going to get found out. I think most people who are truly patriotic will realise actually he doesn't really like Britain.
But this is one of the things that the 2 main parties have been basically bad at. They aren't able to deal with the way what you might call the Farage factor, the fact that he's able to really reach out directly to disenfranchised voters, disaffected voters, people who feel that there's nobody there for them anymore, and he manages to grasp them. What are the Tories and Labour getting wrong in their approach that this has been able to happen so rapidly?
It's a really good question. I mean, if you think about the reform phenomenon, what is really behind it? And there are obviously lots of things behind it, right? There's no one thing. But if I had to say one thing, it's the economy. So you go back to the financial crash, 2007, 2008. The national income, and therefore the incomes of all of us, were absolutely smashed to pieces. And we had to borrow a lot of money to sort of stave off it going worse. And then it was very relatively slow getting back, and real wages have basically stagnated. And people are pretty angry about that. They can't afford a house. The cost of living, the reason why people are angry is because things cost so much, right? And the public services have fallen back in standards. So people are angry. And what's happened is Farage has tapped into that. He's really clever at that, needling away at that. And I think what others have failed to do is to sort of understand that's the root cause and then put forward an alternative agenda of change. There's a real danger that people defend the status quo. I mean, the status quo is not good enough. The status quo is awful, right? I mean, I don't think some of the hyperbole we get from reform is right, but who can be happy with the current state? So we have to set forward an alternative, and that's what we're trying to do. Whether it's on Europe being far more pro-European, whether it's talking about cutting people's energy bills, whether it's saying you can have a different approach to health and care, and reforming the voting system. We've got as a radical centre party, if you like, a whole set of series of changes. And I think if we keep on about that level of ambition, that level of vision, it will increasingly garner attention. And because it's based on decent values and proper evidence, unlike some people I could mention, I think when people actually have to make the choice, I'm more optimistic, very optimistic actually, about our chances.
So you spoke there about people being angry, and we've seen that illustrated in sort of anger towards immigrants and people that have come to this country. And so related to all this, we asked Patreon people, our supporters, for some questions for you.
Okay.
And Sam Proctor has come up with one, and he has said, Lib Dem voter here, so that's good from Sam.
Thanks, Sam.
I'd like to know more about...
For now. For now. Pressure's on.
This is Sam. I'd like to know more about how you plan to counter the argument that all immigration and immigrants are bad, that is polluting our airwaves at the moment.
Well, two ways. I think first you do have to point to the fact that immigrants play a critical role in our health and care service. For example, I mean, it was the new Reform leader of Kent County Council who was criticised the Labour government for restricting visas for immigrant care workers. So clearly other people have woken up to this fact that we've been blessed by the positive contribution and still are. But I think you also have to admit that the Conservatives lost control of immigration. And they claim they were trying to drive immigration down, whilst at the same time massively expanding it. And I give the example of care workers for a reason. I've absolutely no problem with care workers helping us in our care homes and so on. But why don't we pay care workers more? And maybe people who are in this country at the moment would work in care homes. Because at the moment, I mean, working in a care home or working as a care worker is not easy. It's quite demanding, actually, and emotionally draining often. But we pay them peanuts. And people can get as much or about the same in a supermarket, in an Amazon warehouse. And guess what they say? Well, I have an easier time, predictable hours. I'm going to do that rather than work in a care home. So unless we get serious about valuing care and care workers and seeing it as a proper profession on a par with health workers, I don't think we're going to be able to get enough care workers from our own country. And people like Reform in Kent, as well as the Tories, will then have to break all their promises again. So, this is the way you win the debate on immigration. You show that people are making a positive contribution, but you say, quite rightly, that they did lose control. The Tories did lose control quite clearly. And I personally think that what happened with all the asylum hotels was a deliberate policy of the Conservatives. They delayed the processing of asylum applicants, so a queue was created, and then all these people then had to be housed. And Labour needs to really crack on with this. Needs to, process these applicants so they're not in hotels, so they're not costing a fortune. And by the way, adopt the Liberal Democrat policy of allowing asylum seeker applicants to work. Isn't it crazy that you're not allowed to work as an asylum seeker and therefore the taxpayers having to pay for you to be in a hotel and to pay for your food when you could be contributing? So there is a very Liberal Democrat perspective. By the way, what I've said we've been saying for years. It's not new. And I think it's an approach which recognises there are concerns about immigration, but also deals with them in a principled, humane way.
What would you say is the answer to populism? Because a lot of people say that it's basically doing things better, delivery and things like that. But that feels like quite a sort of weak or kind of not very strong answer to the issue, which is taking over politics all across the world. Like how do we get to a point where governments can do radical things without just being radical right things?
Well, you show the flaws in the populist argument, and you show that you have an alternative change agenda, essentially. And the flaws in the populist right agenda are pretty evident the other side of the Atlantic. And if anyone thinks that Donald Trump's doing a terribly good job as prices go up and the American economy goes down, and America's reputation is globally is being hit, that's populism. Do we really want Prime Minister Nigel Farage, God help us, cozying up to Donald Trump, cozying up to Vladimir Putin, hating Britain and liking these populist leaders around the world? I don't think we do. So we've got to show the flaws and take the fight to those people.
I was going to say, taking the fight seems to be something that I think Hannah's already touched on it. The Tories and Labour seem to be totally unable to do at the moment with reform. That they sort of, the only thing they do is say, well, yes, they have some points, but we think that in a slightly less mad way sort of thing. Whereas it feels like very few people are sort of taking on reform and saying, you're wrong about this, or this is a bad idea.
Well, I certainly try to in my chances that come around. I mean, to take the issue of Donald Trump, which I just touched on, the Tories seem to like Donald Trump, and they'd probably like to be more forward-leaning on it, but they know the British people actually dislike Donald Trump. And reform has gone hot and cold, but ultimately loves Donald Trump, don't they? But half of reform voters don't like Donald Trump. So there's a weak spot. Now, Labour is in a bit of a difficult position as the government, and I think it's taken the wrong approach, by the way, to Donald Trump, as it so happens. But it's decided that as a government, it's got to play footsie with them. I think it'll bite them myself, and I don't think it's as effective as an alternative approach, which we've been advocating. So, is there a bigger issue than what Donald Trump is doing to the world at the moment, whether it's Ukraine or Gaza or trade and our economy? And we've got distinctive position, and we're taking on the right and taking on the government. So if that's the way to deal with populism, we're doing that.
So Europe and potentially one day rejoining the EU is a big thing for listeners of this podcast.
Really?
It's sort of what the podcast was born out of, and also a big deal for Lib Dem voters as well. And, potentially a quick solution perhaps for some of the economic difficulties we find ourselves in. But at the moment, it feels as if this kind of reset is about as far as this government is going to be prepared to go. You also haven't come out full throttle and said, right, we are now the rejoin party. You two have sort of spoken about, the idea about coming back into a customs union or whatever. Why not just come out, as Alan Garrick, another listener, says, when will the party grasp the low-hanging fruit of 60% polling in favour of rejoining the EU?
Listen, I don't think anyone can accuse the Liberal Democrats of not being pro-European.
No.
We have been pro-European forever and remain pro-European. We had a very pro-European
But what about
manifesto.
just let's rejoin now?
Because I do think there are two reasons, actually. First of all, I think you have to listen to voters and take them with you. I think if you don't do that, I think that's not very democratic. And I think we have made mistakes in the past on that. And also, Europe's not going to want us back at the moment, right? For multiple reasons. So, realpolitik says, actually do the things that voters will support, which Europe will support, which are deliverable and can give you a really positive view of Europe. And that's why I made a speech about the customs union, why it's our Liberal Democrat policy to not rejoin the customs union, because you can't actually. You have to have a special bespoke customs union. Other countries have them, Turkey, for example. And if you do that, you get huge economic benefits pretty quickly. And the disbenefits where you can't, negotiate your own trade policy, and then they're pretty minor. The advantages and economic benefits that could come quite quickly of a proper customs union are huge. And, the country needs that growth. It needs to push down prices. It needs that extra investment. And I think there's probably no other single measure better than that. And that could be done pretty quickly.
But ahead of the next election, can you envisage just coming out and saying, we want to apply to come back in?
Well, the truth is you've got to have a conversation with our European colleagues, right? And the conversation hasn't really started. You started this discussion on the reset and saying how timid, well, it wasn't your words, but let me rephrase it, timid and pathetic. And I would totally agree. I think the reset it's really been nothing. I mean, better than Conservatives, but that's a pretty low bar. And it's almost as they're scared of talking about it. We're not. We've called for a youth mobility scheme, for example. We've called for a customs union. We've called for all the measures they had in the reset and more, much, much more. And I think there's a positive case to talk to Europe and say, look, let's re-engage with some of these issues which are no-brainers, whether it's over our aerospace, whether it's over Erasmus and exchange of students, a whole range of issues which are clearly in our mutual benefit, which Europe would agree to pretty readily. So there's a big agenda there, and I think you could change people's views on Europe, as well as growing the economy and creating jobs and opportunities for young people.
Time for a breather, and that means But Your Emails, where we answer questions from our Patreon backers and listeners. Usually it's just us on the panel answering, but with Ed here today, we thought it was greedy for us to hog all the questions, so here are a couple from all of you, the great British podcasting public, to Ed. Claire Lloyd asks, what does Ed think about the everything is broken, Britain is going to hell in a handcart, doomsterism narrative which is being promulgated by the right at the moment?
Claire, really good question. Quite a lot of it is nonsense, but there's no doubt there's some of it that is true. Like I said earlier, people's real incomes have stagnated. People are rightly, understandably feeling like things aren't working and a lot of public services aren't working. But take crime. You've seen this summer reforms try to say we're a lawless society. Now, crime is too high. Let's be clear about that. Liberal Democrats want more community police. We want to push down crime even further. But actually, crime, as measured by the British Crime Survey, has been falling for quite a period. In my constituency, for example, we are one of the safest boroughs in London. I'm still campaigning for more action to tackle the crime that we have, because there should be no complacency when it comes to crime, whether it's violent crime, whether it's burglary, whether it's shoplifting, whatever it is. That's a duty of government to push that down. But what Farage and Reform have been saying in the narrative that Claire's referring to is clearly not borne out by the evidence.
And I've got another question from Dave Harper. ID cards have traditionally been a hard no topic for the Lib Dems, and now they're back in the news again. Could it be time to revisit this policy?
Well, the old ID cards that we opposed when Labour sort of flirted with the idea in the noughties, we'd still be opposed to. If there are other ideas and methods that are more technologically advanced, I mean, maybe one could consider those. If it can be done efficiently, which protects people's civil liberties and writes their own data, that's really, really, really important. So still very determined to look after people's freedoms and civil liberties from an overpowering state. State power is something that people should be worried about, and I don't think people are enough worried about it. Liberal Democrats will always be worried about overbearing state power. But if there are things that can help people and make a better, more prosperous society, we'll always look at them.
I think we want to sort of talk about some more broader sort of questions about politics at the moment. And we've already talked a bit about reform, so I don't think we want to talk about that too much. But I have a specific sort of personal question, which is my new show, which I'm doing in Edinburgh, thank you, next week and on tour, is called Legitimate Concerns. Because I feel like that's a phrase that is used over and over again by politicians to sort of suggest something which is slightly dog whistly. And every time I hear it, it sort of makes me flinch. So I suppose my question is it possible to talk about reform, immigration and things like that without using phrases like legitimate concerns, which I think often are used as a way of sort of hinting at something, but not actually saying it out loud?
Did I say legitimate concerns
no, you didn't,
earlier?
Which is I'm going to challenge you to not say that. But I suppose
never say it again. That's what you want to say, Matt.
But I suppose I'm asking a question about sort of political language. Like, is it possible to? It feels like there are lots of these sort of phrases that are used as a way to sort of not really answer the question and hint at something that perhaps you don't fully intend to.
Well, I think the more honest and upfront you are about the challenges, the better. I guess some of the challenge with politics is it can be a bit more complicated than a simple soundbite.
Yeah.
So when you talked about immigration earlier, I was saying, look, of course immigrants have played an incredibly important role in our economy and in our society, made a massive contribution. It should be recognised and celebrated. But there is no doubt that the Conservatives created a huge problem by letting things get out of control. And I think you can say that as a progressive politician and it be true. You don't have to use phrases like legitimate concerns, but you can point out that problems have arisen.
Yeah. Because
when there's that very significant rise in a very short space of time, it comes with some cost for everybody.
So do you think it's about sort of talking? I suppose it feels to me like often there's this sort of elision between immigration and immigrants, that you can talk about how immigration might be too high in certain ways, or as you say, the Boris wave, as people talk about, was too high. But that doesn't mean that immigrants themselves are a problem, as it were. And I think we've talked about already that feels like that's what's happening at the moment a lot of the time in the discourse, is that people are sort of pointing at them as being the problem rather than the issue.
Well, I 100% agree with that. There's no doubt that there are some people, I'm afraid I'm going to bring in Nigel Farage and others, who are Robert Jenrick, who are trying to say all our problems are caused by these people. And that clearly isn't true. And I think I saw a chart on social media, needs to be checked out, but it was from Fraser Nelson, who's a reputable journalist, and he's from the right of British politics, who showed level of crime going down over 30 years and level of immigration going up. And they were inversely correlated, which means that higher immigration has come at the same time as lower crime. Exactly the reverse of what Nigel Farage is saying. So I think you're right. He's trying to find someone to blame. And he's people who are angry about the fact their wages haven't gone up, or that public services aren't working as they wanted to. They're angry, and he's trying to say, you're right to be angry. Be angry at those people who caused it.
Yeah.
Not at the politicians who failed or the financial system that's failed, who are the real causes. I mean, bad government has caused us a lot of these problems. The financial sector really let the country down, let's face it, in the financial crash. Nigel Farage isn't having any of that. He doesn't want to deal with the real stories. He wants to blame someone else. And I completely agree with that analysis.
Now, I know we spoke about the high points and low points of the last coalition, and I'm sure that you would say that you're never ever going to go into a coalition ever again because you're going to win on your own. But if at the next election we are looking at Reform significantly increasing their share, is there the possibility of a Lib pact?
One thing I've said before the last election when I was asked similar questions, so I'm being consistent, is that I've noticed over time, having been in politics a little while, that when Liberal Democrat leaders focus on what happens after the election, they don't do so well before the election. And my job is to do as well as I possibly can for the party, and the party do as well as it possibly can for the country at the next general election. And if you focus beyond that, I'm afraid you are not taking people with you. You're showing your only interest in power when you're trying to address people's concerns. And so I'm going to stick to that. we are going to, just as we did in the last Parliament, it did prove rather successful at the general election, focus on what is worrying people. And we're going to explain to people that it's not some other person to blame, it's this government, the previous government. The political system has let people down. I'm really happy to say that. Believe it or not, Liberal Democrats want to reform the political system, have done for quite some time. And we will keep saying that too.
Well, it does look like reform could actually be big beneficiaries of the first-past-the-post system.
Well, indeed. I mean, I've heard people, particularly people in the Labour Party, who've said, well, you can't do PR because it lets the right in. Hold on, first past the post wouldn't just let the right in, it would give them power, right? So I think people who've opposed PR and the left of British politics need to think again.
But do you think there's any chance that other people are going to come on board with proportional representation as a...
Well, I mean, it is the official Labour Party policy. Don't forget that. There are a lot of Labour MPs who support it. There are a lot of, apparently Reform support it, though who knows what they think, because you can't quite trust them. But there are other parties who are up for it, and maybe there are even Conservatives now who are thinking. It's very interesting.
Yes.
In the dying days of the 2017-2019 Parliament, a number of Conservatives have been thrown out of the Conservative Party by Boris Johnson, said, you guys, you were always right about PR.
Thinking about the next election, to do just as well or build on your previous success, you do have to retain some kind of core areas like Oxfordshire, which had unprecedented result there. Some of that yes, you've won many arguments on the centre, but there's also been a big demographic shift in some of those areas. I'm very interested in this because I grew up in Didcot, so I was shocked to see the results, happily shocked. But actually, a lot of people have been pushed into that area as a result of house prices, moving out of London into the commuter belt, and the voting demographic has changed. There are a lot of former Labour voters in those areas now who are voting for the Lib Dems in order to keep the Conservatives out. That's been brilliant for you, but it doesn't necessarily mean that you've won the whole argument. And there's a tension coming up now, which is, you mentioned earlier that you are very good as a party at managing trade-offs in communities, but we're in a housing crisis, and actually in some of those areas the Lib Dems are starting to gain a bit of a reputation for NIMBYism, and that really puts off those former Labour voters. How do you plan to hold on to those type of areas when these tensions between your new Labour defectors and your new Tory defectors begin to, struggle with each other?
There's a lot in that question. Let me unpack it a little bit. First of all, after the last election, directly after, one of the things that journalists liked to say to me was, you've won 72. How are you going to hold? You never hold 72. Do you know what? They don't ask me that anymore. I think they see...
Well, I just did, though.
Well, yeah, you did, but it's so rare a question. That's why I'm pointing it out. Because I think they see the decline of the Conservative Party. Well, no, we've not talked about that. We've talked about reform. Let's focus on the Conservative Party. Utter disaster. They are shambles in Parliament, and utter shambles, and they're trying to chase reform's tail, and they have shown no sign of coming back in any, whether it was local elections, council by-elections, or in Parliament. And so those seats that we won from the Conservatives, while we are far from complacent, our MPs, I think, are really impressing people in their local work as MPs as well as their work in Parliament. And I think we can hold on to those seats. Now, you mentioned one specific issue about development and managing that. It's interesting. I go around a lot of Liberal Democrat-run councils, and I see lots of Liberal Democrat-run councils building houses, not just my wife in Kingston, but you go to Eastleigh, you go to South Cam, you go to many other places. Liberal Democrats are actually building homes, but we're doing it a different way. And what we're trying to do is involve the community and make sure that when we do the development, that it meets the needs of people. Because one of the problems we've had with development, and still the system is prone to this problem, it's top down. Developer comes along, says, "We want to do this. All right, you can have your planning permission." And what about the roads and other public transport? What about the sewage infrastructure? What about the social infrastructure with doctors and schools and so on? That is too often an afterthought, right? And that's why people really don't like it. And it's interesting, if you talk to lots of people, they don't mind extra housing as long as that supporting infrastructure is there at the same time. So that's how we make that argument, how we square that circle. And lots of those people who were Labour voters moving to Oxford voting for us tactically, maybe they'll become Liberal Democrats and not just vote for us tactically. Before the last election, we talked about the Surrey shufflers. Right? People who shuffled into Surrey out of London, some of whom were Labour voters who started voting for us tactically. And our results in Surrey were almost as outstanding as they were both Oxfordshire and Surrey were amazing results. In over 100 years, there'd only been 4 non-Tory MPs in Surrey. Only 4 in over 100 years. There are now 6 Liberal Democrat MPs in Surrey, and we're going for more at the next election.
I mean, there's also, if Labour keep chasing down reform so hard on those issues, you're likely to keep them on that basis. But
well, I talked earlier, didn't I, about Middle England. Now, that's a loose term, I accept, but I think we have a sense of what it means. People who have decent values, who believe in our country, who expect the economy to run properly, who expect you to care about the defence of our country, expect you to, deliver decent public services for everybody. It's not an unreasonable set of demands, right? Now, where's that in our debate? Well, it's us. And we want to meet those concerns. And in that I think we can take seats, obviously, more off the Conservatives. We've got a lot of them in our sights still. There are some seats that Labour won which are not sort of instinctively Labour, some in rural areas, and I think they may well lose those. We want to pick those up. And so I think, we'll see. It's way too early. And unlike other party leaders, I'm not trying to predict the result of the next election beyond saying I think we can make gains and do well.
So just to sort of wrap up, it's obviously been a long 5 years since you became Prime Minister.
I missed that bit. When did that happen?
Edit that in later. And you've obviously always been open about your caring responsibilities, your son who requires round-the-clock support, and you've never really complained about it but talked about it. How do you find combining work and home life? Is the reality of being a leader of a party what you expected it to be?
Let me deal with the first part of the question first. I mean, there are 3 ways we manage. First of all, my wife is astonishing. Despite having MS, she just does amazing care of our children with me, but she's lead and she's a local councillor, building lots of council houses. So she's amazing. I think the second thing is that we're fortunate to get support from our family and friends to help us have a carer, indeed a team of carers. And I'd have to be at home if we didn't have those carers there. And the third thing, I'm a London MP, so when I'm not on the campaign trail, I'm back every night. So, I like to think that I'm a hands-on dad for my daughter, but particularly for my son who needs a lot of care. And I try to be the first person they see every morning. I mean, sometimes I miss out the bedtime, but getting up and given my son often wakes up at 5:30, 6 a.m. and says, "Daddy, get up."
Lovely. Well, thank you very much for spending the afternoon with us, Ed. I think it's been really interesting. It's been interesting insight into the work that you've done over the last 5 years and the work that you've got yet to come. So,
yeah, plenty of that.
So we're at the end of the show, which means it's time for escape routes. So what are the books, films, TV shows or miscellaneous that are helping our panel take their minds off politics? Ed, let's start with you. What have you been enjoying lately?
Well, the best way I escape is a wonderful novel. But if I'm honest with you, most of the year I'm reading stuff which is not fun. But I've just come back from holiday.
Oh, good.
And I read There Are Islands in the Sky by Elif Shafak.
Oh, yes.
Which is fantastic. And
that's one with the rainwater, isn't it? Is that
yeah,
right?
the drop of rain.
Drop of rain.
And I recommend it to anybody. And that really took me out and really relaxed me. And as well as being a brilliant read.
Excellent. And Hannah, what have you been up to?
I finally got around to the Netflix thriller Black Doves, which is basically Keira Knightley and Ben Whishaw being private sector spies and murderers. It's fantastic. I'm really, really late to it, so I'm sure most of you who are listening have already seen it. But for those who haven't, please make the time. I put this off for ages, and it's a glorious portrait of a kind of underbelly of London, beautifully acted, really moving in many ways as well. So yeah, big recommendation. But I also want to note that thanks to the glory of social media, I've had been a welcome/unwelcome reminder that it's as we record, tomorrow is 30 years since the big Blur versus Oasis spat. And so on the back of that, I started reading a book which has been on my bookshelf for a while, which is Alex James's Over the Rainbow, which is basically a diary of their reunion a couple of years ago. That's Blur. Alex James is the bassist. As a piece of writing, it's pretty disappointing, actually. I wouldn't necessarily recommend the book, but I have to say I can't help but find his sort of unwillingness to be bogged down by anything and just general indulgence in life, in food, booze, and having a laugh pretty inspiring in these dark times. So if you want 90s. A bit of exactly. If you want a bit of nostalgia for that, have a read.
Excellent. And Matt?
Well, funny you mentioned Black Doves. I was watching The Assassin, which is on Prime, which is sort of like Black Doves but bad. So don't watch that. With Keely Hawes and other people in it. Yeah, it started well, but wasn't a fan. But I've been reading Anthony Horowitz's fifth book in his Hawthorne series, Close to Death, which is about it's a sort of murder mystery from the writer of Magpie Murders and things like that. It's about people who move into a sort of close of houses, and then one of them is murdered. And we moved into a close of houses last year, so it had this sort of lovely metatextuality about it. Of like, I wonder if our neighbours think about the same about us.
So if you wind up dead, we'll know that you've been murdered. And which neighbour was it?
I'll know exactly who did it. Yeah.
And I've been reading again very late to the party. I mean, Bel Canto by Anne Pratchett, which came out I think about 2001, won lots of awards at the time, and it's about a siege in an embassy which is somewhere in sort of Latin America, but I think it is based on the actual siege that took place in Peru back in the 90s, and it's the relationship between the hostages and the people that take them hostage, and it's brilliant. Really enjoyed it. And that's the end of the show. Thank you to our special guest, Liberal Democrat leader Ed Davey.
Thank you.
And thank you to Hannah Fearn.
Thank you.
And thank you, Matt Green.
Thank you.
Oh God, What Now? We'll be back on Monday for our backers and Tuesday morning for everyone else. Thanks for listening. See you next time.